Good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be with you here this afternoon. I'm really delighted to see so many of you here. I'm Gail Zermak-Lamont, Adjunct Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and the author of several books set in places that most would consider to be fragile. This is a topic that is very dear to me because as we talk about fragility, conflict, and violence, the thing that is so important is to remember the strength, courage, and resilience that is at the heart of so many people working for so much that is better in their own societies. And that's really what we wanted to talk about today. We're going to talk about the challenges of fragility, conflict, and violence and the work the World Bank is doing in this arena. By 2030, it's estimated that about half of the world's extreme poor will live in fragile and conflict-affected environments. Since 2010, the number of major violent conflicts has tripled, and I don't think any of us need to look very far to see where that is going. More than 70 million people right now, 70 million. I think the numbers get so big that sometimes our imaginations can't even capture them, are forcibly displaced by conflict and violence worldwide. And as most of you know, that is the highest number since the Second World War. Today we're going to hear from leaders who are really at the forefront of tackling the complexity of this. And we promise not to give you easy answers, but to talk about the way that things are unfolding, what we're learning, the work people are doing, and leaders at the forefront of making change. We're really going to talk about the long-term efforts to address the root causes of fragility, conflict, and violence, to build resilience in crisis situations, support the most vulnerable communities, and help countries escape situations of fragility, conflict, and violence to achieve peace and prosperity over the long term. And the thing that I think about most is all the moms I've had the privilege of meeting in very difficult circumstances and fragile situations who are actually warriors for something better for their children. And it is on their side that I come to you here today. And it is on their side that I think all of the work that we do each day in this arena of fragility, conflict, and violence deeply matters. Because it's not for people in beautiful atriums like this one. It's for moms who are struggling every single day to figure out how to get their children to school, how to get them home, how to fight for something better for their own communities, and who really are on the forefront of the battle for security and prosperity and stability in their own communities. And so many times we talk about them, and I think what I really want to do today is talk about how we work with them, because that is what each and every one of the people on this stage do. And it's what I have the privilege of seeing firsthand. The most courageous people, the most resilient people, and most definitely the most innovative people I have ever met are people who are working through fragility and violence, for whom these aren't words, but realities. And so as we approach this discussion, I just wanted us to start with really honoring their courage and what they do every single day to create something better. Today's event is being webcast online to a global audience in English, Spanish, French, and Arabic. There's simultaneous interpretation available here in the room. You can follow the conversation on Twitter by using the hashtag #DevForPeace. That is DEV, the number 4, and peace. There's also a tweet cheat sheet on your chair with some suggested tweets. Before I introduce the panel, I just want to note that even assembling this panel showed some of the challenges. Some very dear friends from Afghanistan and Somalia wanted to be here but could not travel and be here, and the UN humanitarian chief was pulled away by the unfolding situation in Syria. I myself have been going back and forth to Syria for the past 2 years, and I just really hope that his work goes well. So we are indeed fortunate to be here with this incredible group of speakers who have come to talk about the work they do on the forefront every day. We have the Minister Kane from Niger. We have Henrietta Fore, the Executive Director of UNICEF, Axel von Trotzenberg from the World Bank, and Nancy Lindberg of the U.S. Institute for Peace. So I want to welcome all of you and thank you for making the time to talk about your very important work on these topics. And I want to start with Minister Kane. What is Niger's approach to addressing the root causes of fragility, conflict, and violence, and ensuring that grievances don't escalate into conflict? What have you learned, and what can we learn from what you have learned?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Allow me first to express my gratitude to you for having invited me to this most important panel. In order to understand the approach one uses, one needs to understand the causes of fragility. If Niger is considered as fragile in some areas, it is because of the shocks to which we are confronted. For a long time, as a country of the Sahel, we've had to undergo climate shocks with all their many consequences on the lives of populations and making them more vulnerable. For about since 2010, 2011, we are under a security shock, which has a direct impact on the vulnerable populations. So if you look at all these situations of fragility, we have not yet moved to a situation of conflict, but we can consider that a conflict exists because of the climate shocks. It's not an armed military conflict. What we are dealing with is a security conflict with terrorist attacks and so forth. So vis-à-vis all of this in Niger, we took a number of measures in order to prevent the consequences of that fragility, that vulnerability. In terms of climate, we have put in place an important mechanism of prevention and management of crisis tied to climate change. We have a whole toolkit of measures to do that. Why? Because we want the most vulnerable, the people most affected, can benefit from a particular attention so that their situation does not become impossible to solve because of the vulnerability. As far as security is concerned, we have also taken a number of measures, generally speaking, because we've put in place a number of institutional mechanisms and very concrete measures in order to face demand as it is, which emanates from this vulnerability to conflict. And our aim is to make sure that we have the best possible measures as close as possible to the population. We want to listen carefully to young people to find out what are the vulnerabilities that are tied to the management of a household, because we are in a tremendous situation of food insecurity. And the result is a series of actions that we are implementing to deal. If I have the time, I can give you the details of those actions that we have taken. Thank you.
It's not, I promise, me getting in trouble when they fixed my microphone. I hope you can hear me better. And really now, what I want to do is talk to Nancy Lindberg, building upon those comments. You have focused at USIP, and I've done a lot of work and had the privilege of being there to talk about Afghanistan, lots of other places, of talking about governance in fragile settings, including justice and security, and institutions that are focused on justice and security, which are two very big topics that shape the way people live. And I wonder, how can this be supported by development actors? How do you see that?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here. Thank you, and I applaud the bank for holding this forum, as well as for having such a wonderful, I think, important consultative approach to the new strategy that the bank is doing on fragility and conflict. And development is a critical player, a critical set of tools for addressing the fundamentals of a fragile state, as we've just heard from the minister. And, you know, if we think of fragility as creating greater vulnerability to shocks, both environmental and security shocks, it takes a very specific diagnostic. And I believe the challenge for the development community, as we move, as the bank's strategy rightly notes, towards prevention of conflict, to get ahead of a country falling prey to the shocks that we just heard about. It requires looking a little differently at how you do your development work, a greater focus on the justice and security aspects of understanding why people may feel marginalized or not have confidence in their government or have a very fragmented society. These are all some of the fissures that run through a community that makes it more vulnerable to the shocks and less able to manage conflict without violence or respond to environmental shocks. So I see these as deeply integrated, that development, justice, security are all part of one package. And if you think about it in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, and you look at that Goal 16, which is about peace, justice, security, inclusive institutions, it is also what enables the gains in the development world. So it's very much a package of interaction and of mutually entwined objectives, and you need the whole piece to move together to sustain the goals and move towards peace.
And that's what I want to talk about. You see, I've done a microphone switch, so I hope this is a little better for all of you. That's what that holistic approach is, I think, what makes the fact that the bank is really doing and focusing on this work so exciting. In 2005, I was in business school and wrote a piece for the IFC on women entrepreneurs in post-conflict environments. And I remember meeting all these amazing entrepreneurs and talking to them, and they were just getting on with it, starting businesses in some of the most fragile settings, you know, creating jobs for people, really, you know, building hope, manufacturing hope in a way that I think we haven't often seen. And so I would like to talk to Axel a little bit about, I know that the World Bank is really getting even more deeply involved in this whole idea of addressing fragility, conflict, and violence in a very formal way. Why, and then what is the bank's approach as you really tackle the holistic view of fragility, conflict, and violence?
Well, I think the why is very clear, that today we have still 700 million extreme poor. But the harsh reality is that most of the extreme poor are living in fragile states, and the number of fragile states have been increasing. And if we want to make any progress on combating poverty, you will have to concentrate on fragile states. Now, this brings us all probably in the discomfort zone, because there are no ready answers for this. And so what we have to see is, first of all, the bank often was, in previous year always, we say we will be engaged in post-conflict. Well, that luxury you don't have anymore. So you have to think differently. And you can also not think, well, the bank couldn't do it alone. So the thing is that we have been in a very learning process, and when we are looking at also the strategy, is basically that the consultations is basically exploiting all the experience of different actors to see where the bank can play a complementary role. We cannot do it alone. We will do that in concert of all. And I think that was the usefulness, first and foremost, the countries that themselves are affected, that we actually learn, and therefore the drivers of the conflicts are so important to understand that. But similarly, many other actors have UN, CSOs, governments, but also the difficult nexus between development, humanitarian assistance, and then also the military aspect. They have become much more blurred, and this is our reality. I think that the World Bank doesn't pretend to have the solutions, but I think only through a dialogue we can have mutual learning, but it should also not mean that there is also room for inaction. I think what we have to do, we have to act, and over the years we have scaled up our support. Mainly through IDA, but just to give you an idea, over the last 2 years, we committed $15 billion for fragile states in the poorest countries as well as in middle-income countries. Now, the poorest, mainly in IDA, that's about 12 billion, 3 billion for middle-income countries. If you take that for the Sahel 5 countries, it has been we have jacked up that support to about $3.5 billion in the last 2 years. Is that enough? Absolutely not. But it is, I think, every organization has to do the maximum possible what we will do. The good news is that also in the IDA 19 negotiation, fragility is a special theme and is sky high on the agenda. And therefore the strategy that we are finalizing now in these months for the FCV will be very important to inform us not only as we go into the implementation of IDA 19, but it will also be important for the middle-income countries. I think we should not forget that when we are concentrating on poor countries, we see challenges. I worked myself in Mindanao on the conflict in the Philippines, where we need to do. When you look at the tragedy unfolding in Venezuela, where the richest South American country becomes poor, and 90% is affected of poverty, and 4.5 million people are leaving their homes, you get a sense of the dimension that you cannot take anything anymore for granted. Now, going forward with this, also the public sector will not be able to do it. And I think the minister just already mentioned, if we want to prevent, we will need to give hope also to the people who are affected. And that means they need jobs, they need a future. So what we have also tried and started trying with our IFC and MIGA friends is that we have created within IDA a so-called private sector window that helps to de-risk. And we are going through that learning exercise. It's a difficult one, but I actually would like to challenge anybody who is here from the private sector or from other institutions to also create a private sector window, because we need actually massive efforts to seek how we can help create jobs, for example, in Niger, in the more difficult areas. And we will need to help de-risk that. That is not to give a handout to the private sector, but that we need to have a down payment on the future. And that's what we are trying to do.
Thank you. It's interesting. So the first book I had the privilege of writing was about a teenage girl whose business supported her family under the Taliban. And all these girls who were breadwinners during years when they couldn't be out on their streets. And so to me, it's so very exciting to see the power of all of these institutions really be directed at these agents of hope and leaders in their own communities. And I think with that, I wanted to go to Henrietta, who, what is the role of the UN and UNICEF as we're talking about the bank and USIP and the role of government as we think holistically, as Axel was saying, nobody can do it alone. But as we think holistically about how to lift up people who are already making change on the ground and how to create justice and peace and help and support governments who are really working for stability, what is the role of the UN and UNICEF?
So thank you. And I'm also adding into Nancy's thank you to the World Bank for leading this. I think it's a crucial moment in time. Nancy has long been talking about fragile states, and I think that we just haven't spent enough time and interest. And when Axel talks about a private sector window, I absolutely agree. I think this is a topic and a subject and a time in which public and private finance can really drive this. So what does the UN do and what does the UNICEF do? So we're very operational. We're operating in every country in the world, and part of what we do is what you were talking about knitting societies together. So whether you're in Niger and you're thinking about the fragile context, you're thinking about the climate, you're thinking about the violence, and you're thinking about ways that you can connect it, we try to put the government ministries' plans together with the national plans that the NGOs have, that the United Nations has, and we try to pull those programs together on the ground. We also try to knit together humanitarian disaster assistance with longer-term development assistance. What Axel talks about and what the minister is talking about is that it's important that we plant those seeds of longer-term development immediately into humanitarian situations. We see this particularly for children because education and water are needed the day of the crisis, and they are needed 5 years later. So humanitarian and development is a very important link, but so too is the fact that you don't create a parallel system. So you have to make sure that the government still operates. And in these fragile contexts, one of the things that happens is that countries begin to pull apart, and the segments of their society pull apart. And then to your mothers who are so brave and looking for places for their children, what also happens is that in times of fragility, the services become very unequal. And as a result, it fuels tensions, it fuels conflict, so that unless you do it, you try to do it in an even, connected way, we can sometimes make these situations worse. So what the UN and many other actors do is try to knit together all of these pieces so that the countries and the families are not so fragile.
You talk about education. I was in a camp for the displaced 2 summers ago from conflict, and I met a 13 or 14-year-old girl. And those of you who've been in those situations know those girls often don't have a lot of mobility. You don't see them out a lot. And so I went up to this girl and I said, you know, what do you want when this is over? And she said, I just want to go back to school. And I said, well, what's your favorite subject? And she said, I don't care. And then I was leaving, and I said, you know, tell me about what you think about your future. And at the end, she looked at me and said, I wish you would come every day. And I think that points to the fact that there are all these girls who have so many aspirations. There's so much untapped potential. And I deeply believe that suffocated potential is the enemy of global stability. And I think at the end of the day, it's what we're talking about here today, right? And tapping into that potential. And I think with that, to Henrietta's point, to the minister, I would just want to go to the point of local ownership. Because it's so important that it is actually local leaders who are leading this agenda. And I wonder how you see that. How can the World Bank and other partners really support countries to address the root causes and also to really think for the long term?
Thank you. I really like the way you place at the very heart of the history and of the story the human dimension, the human being. Before you asked us question, you tell us stories of human interests, human beings who live in a fragile, vulnerable situation. This is what must be our guide. This is what guides us. This is what has been guiding us when we try to define our strategies. As I said this morning, from the start, we have integrated this in our development strategy for sustainable development and long-term inclusive growth. We've brought back these strategies to the medium term, 5 years. In these strategies, the issues of the couple, security development, is extremely high on the agenda. The issue of human capital is there too. The demographic challenge, which is a source of vulnerability as well. People don't realize that the demographic bomb is also a source of fragility. So we've taken all these elements into account in our strategy. We defined our strategies, we define our priorities, and we defined how we wanted to act. Our partners came to support us, among whom the World Bank. If we're talking about climate, we have a program which I love to mention, this fabulous program we have with the World Bank, which creates conditions for climate resilience, as well as an increase in agricultural productivity and of a global support for all the farmers through the digital technology. This way we can connect all those farmers. They can find out about irrigation, about solar, and production can be increased. We've integrated the gender dimension here too. So we have programs such as these and others for which the World Bank is supporting, helping Niger. Axel has talked about millions of dollars, but these millions of dollars, we are using them according to our priorities, those priorities that we define with the support of the World Bank. Let me give you another example, an issue of security. Boko Haram one day attacked the Bossou village. Bossou is at the border between Nigeria and Niger. 20,000 people left their village. They went to connect with others, or they moved in the middle of the bush. So all of a sudden, need of water, need of education, need of health services, and so forth. What did we do with the World Bank? We had projects there. A project for cattle herding, a project for education, and so forth. And we said, all these projects are going to be combined so we can do together what we need to do what we wanted to do in 2 years, we're going to do it in 6 months. And in a few months, we organized classes and pastures and provided all the services for these people from Niger that had been displaced. We provide them with the services that they needed, the infrastructures they needed. And in terms of, and with the help of the humanitarian groups that were there, they were already there, UNICEF and many others, they were all there. And it was a sort of global movement. As Axel said, we can't act alone. We don't have the only solution. The solution must be global, but it must come from us first. It is not a matter of simply UNICEF come and say, okay, here's the solution, implement it. No, the solution is from Niger, and this is how we've worked it. We follow this approach with all of our partners, and we get good results. We achieve good results, and we continue to work in this direction. I was flabbergasted. I'm from Niger. I was so amazed that I could be a part of an exchange between a farmer who had a problem because of his field was being attacked by some kind of caterpillar he couldn't control, and I was there. We talked on the cell phone. And we found a solution, and we said, here's where you go to find the pesticide to get rid of the caterpillar. Don't use this one because it's bad for your plants or for your family or for you. A farmer who says, where can I find the seeds? He gets the answer. A farmer who says, where can I find fertilizers? Gets the answer. That's a World Bank project. So that's what I wanted to say. I think it's very important And I'm waiting for your final question to say more to you even. Thank you.
Merci à vous. Thank you. And sort of building on that, when you go to Nancy and then when I go to ACTO, Nancy, talk about the challenges that spill across borders, and one of the challenges is extremism. And I wonder how the U.S. Institute for Peace really tackles that. What do development actors do to address the root causes of that? How do you see that issue that goes across borders?
Thank you. And you said in your opening remarks that we're in an era with historic numbers of displaced people. I mean, a lot of the big challenges and threats to global peace right now, whether it's displacement, civil war, violent extremism, the common denominator to that is state fragility, and global poverty is clustered there. One of the things that U.S. Institute of Peace does is serve as a platform for bringing people together from across a lot of viewpoints to wrestle with really tough problems. And we were asked by the U.S. Congress to convene a task force looking at the problem of violent extremism in fragile states. And as that task force really looked into the issues and looked at what are the conditions in fragile states that enable violent extremist ideology to take root and recruit to the cause, it's really those conditions that characterize a fragile state, where you have fragmented societies, unmet grievances, the inability of a state to provide for the needs of its people. And so their recommendations that came out of that task force really built on a lot of the research and the shared conversations that a lot of us have been having for a decade. And at the heart are development concepts. At the heart is a recognition that if we want to look at the conditions in a fragile state, you need to have an approach that is locally led, where it's the people driving the solutions, that it has to be long-term and iterative, that you need to look at development, security, and politics as a combined set of issues, and you need to do it in partnership. These are the elements that we're seeing in the World Bank strategy, that we need to look at how to align the efforts. These are not new concepts, but they're coming to fruition through the leadership of institutions like the World Bank, built on a lot of experience. That is, I am very hopeful right now that we're at a moment where a lot of this will now actually coalesce into institutional action and move us from talking about it to making it happen. And of note, a lot of these recommendations are contained in a bill that is moving through the U.S. Congress right now called the Global Fragility Act, that enshrines some of these core concepts and enables the U.S. to create greater alignment across our development, security, and diplomacy actors. And there's a pilot project moving forward right now in Burkina Faso, where we have an enormous opportunity to align what U.S. government does with a really wonderful assessment that the EU, the UN, and the World Bank are doing. So we have a moment of alignment that will test all of our bureaucracies, because it's really hard. We live and think and act in stovepipes, but there is an extraordinary opportunity to do it differently and to put these development core concepts into action.
And on that extraordinary opportunity note, I want to go to Axel to talk about you. World Bank is a development finance institution and can bring a long-term approach, really, to this. And I wonder, how do you think about the fragility agenda with a long-term approach and with financing at scale?
Well, first, this is not new. Let's keep in mind that 75 years ago, there were the negotiations of the Bretton Woods, and we created the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. We thought that the R would be less important over time, and unfortunately, it is still a capital letter and bold. And so this has been with us. I think what all of you, and Nancy and yourself, Henriette said, it is important that we think about the long term. I think this is particularly important when the interventions are coming in fragile states. Sometimes one is concentrated on emergency support, and they are very important. But I think we need always to have that linkage. I think UNICEF is trying, we for example, are supporting UNICEF in its effort to provide education services in Jordan in some of the camps for Syrian refugees. I think it's terribly important that the humanitarian support is not only having a short-term perspective, but that there is always immediately a longer one. I think you mentioned also that we should not create parallel systems. It weakens the public sectors, it weakens the institutions of a country. So what we need to do is we need also, our support needs to go through a lens of longer term support, i.e. Think of the health systems, so that we are creating or giving at least a fighting chance that you are creating institutions that can survive over a longer period of time. And so this is, I think, where we need to have it. Then I think we need to think on financing. We bring the financing. Actually, I have not been so negative about World Bank financing because we have been very successful to get very large IDA replenishments and that is good. I'm actually concerned, does this add up? Namely, I have been seeing sometimes the World Bank has been successful. It may have also created for donors, some donors to say, well, I can step back. And then there is no additionality for the country. So I think we need our efforts, when we are scaling up, should not be an excuse for others to withdraw. So the engagement has to be a collective, long-term engagement. Secondly, I think where we are all struggling with is about financing when we are mobilizing resources, let's say for 3 years. But if you are thinking about the Sahel, you may have actually to think not of 3 years, you have to think of 10 years, you have to think of a generational engagement. So that where we are all struggling a little bit because, you know, of appropriation procedures, etc. Nevertheless, I think we need to lift that tension, but in our approaches, we should have this longer term engagement. And finally, it is also then, as soon as it allows, we need to join in the capacity building exercises, because during these fragility periods, unfortunately, a lot of very qualified staffs or people are leaving the country. So it is often even further weakens the institution. So we have to make that effort. And then again, as I said before, the private sector. And here, I think, the local private sector. It's sometimes we hope, well, can we get somewhere a hotel built by an international chain? And it's very good for it. But I think at the end of the day, we need to see, can we create and reach these small and medium-sized enterprises, this smaller, and how can you empower women entrepreneurs in these efforts? And often our means are still not so effective, but we have to work on that. These are the type of packages. And then final word is we need to stay very self-critical. I think despite sometimes very good intentions, sometimes we have bad outcomes. So I think we need to face the fact we need to take risks, because I think if we think we can engage without risk, we will lose it. We will need to dare to get into this. We have also to dare sometimes to fail and learn from that. But I'd rather be criticized for something that you could maybe have been better than non-action. I think that's not an option, and we have to stay very much engaged and take more risk.
Thank you very much. And I think Henrietta, but first I wanted to say that we've been delighted to have Actor here. I know he has to leave us for his next meeting. I promise we did not offend him up here. He really is leaving for his next meeting. And I wanted to go to Henrietta because I think the bank is, you've really framed it so well for us to go forward in terms of thinking about both the challenges and the huge opportunities, right? And so I wanted to go to Henrietta to talk about children, because these are the people who will be the entrepreneurs, the people who will be the teachers, the people who will be the folks who are starting business. And they are the ones who are actually, if you're going to invest in talent today, they are going to be the ones that you will need tomorrow to make sure that the state can have the people and the capacity building and real local talent who is going to grow their own countries and one day won't need development finance institutions because they've reached such high income levels. So I wonder how you think about the children piece, especially in fragile situations.
Well, thank you. I know that young people would love your articulation that they're going to save their countries. They're really excited about it. They want to participate. They want to be part of it. So let me give a couple of examples that we've done with the World Bank, because I think they always give you a sense for what everyone can do to try to improve our world. So one comes from the areas that we've been talking about in the Horn of Africa. So in the Horn of Africa, we have a program in which World Food Program and FAO and UNICEF are all together, and we are trying to both anticipate droughts. We are trying to make sure that farmers have some resilience capacity so that we can actually have harvests and that people will have a chance to have enough food. So young farmers are very important, but as all of you know, young people these days want to go to urban centers. They don't want to become farmers. So part of our call is what Axel was saying, the human capacity. We have got to get more young people really excited about being young farmers. But this notion about prevention and then working in fragile contexts and then trying to stay there long enough is a really important concept. The World Bank has been great about funding it. I think we're going to need lots more of that. And since we're talking about farmers, your Niger farmer with his caterpillars, if we can get the private sector in there, it will be very sustainable. So really important. A second example comes from Mozambique. So after Cyclone Idai came through, I was in Mozambique, and as you know, one of the things that happens in the fact that the winds come through and they are coming through time and time again is the children and their families were separated. So we had lots of protection concerns, both reuniting families, but also just looking after children. And people were gathered and clustered in the schools because the schools had tile roofs and they did not blow off. So they ran to the schools in hopes of getting protection. We did not set up a separate protection program. We actually strengthened the local program of Mozambique. Madam Minister was talking about the importance that it be based around the country strategy. Well, you've got to try to help the country in these situations so that they become stronger. So that's another example. And the third one is in Yemen. Yemen, as you all know, is a true large-scale humanitarian crisis. And the programs we have there with the World Bank allow young people and women to participate in this, but they are just on the edge of survival. So there are cash protection programs, there are nutrition programs, there are health programs. We've been beating back cholera. These are very difficult. The water programs are essential. So it is a combination of human capital and infrastructure and cash protection programs. But that's what Nancy was saying earlier about her very good plan. Look at the root causes, look at how everybody can gather together, and that's how we'll get more solutions. But it's critical, so many places around the world.
Thank you. And with that, I want to be quite candid with my audience. We're going to go to Q&A now, but we only have a few minutes left. And so I'm going to start with a question or two we've come from the audience. And I also want to welcome Frank Bosquet, who is, we're delighted to have him, is the Senior Director for Fragility, Conflict and Violence work here at the bank. And he will join us for the Q&A session. So I'm going to start with some questions from those you cannot see, those in the virtual realm. And then we'll try to take at least one or two from the audience. And I would just urge you to actually make it a question, and in the hopes of hearing from our panelists. And I want to start with a question for really, I think probably each of you will have something to add to it, which is a question from Desmond and Magaz saying, what can we do to help refugee children who are out of school? Because this cuts across all of the work that you are doing. Governance, access to justice, access to institutions, and certainly protecting the vulnerable as they think about their own futures going forward.
So, as many of you know, there's a program, Education Cannot Wait. We have some suitcases that are schools in a box. So the key is get those children back to school and give them a chance to have schools go with them. Because if you're a refugee child or you're out of your own school, you really want the chance to keep learning. So the number one call for all of us is to try to keep the children in school. Bring the schools to them, and that will help them.
I mean, I've seen children in settings where there are no walls, no pencils, no paper, and they're so hungry to learn. And it is in every single person's interest that those little people have access to their future and to education. I think Frank wanted to add.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everybody. So I think that just to build on the point that Axel mentioned, I think the whole point about refugee used to be seen as a humanitarian issue a few years ago, and I think the bank is changing. The bank is actually partnering with many organizations, but also realizing that those crises are protracted crises. So dealing with refugees, it's not about 1 year, 2 years, 3 years agenda. It's about 10 years, 15 years. It's about strengthening education system. It's about strengthening health system. And that's where you get the importance of partnering with humanitarian actors, dealing with short-term agenda, but also long-term. The bank has been scaling up over the past 2-3 years. We have been actually financing up to $2 billion in more than 14 countries hosting refugees. 90% of refugees are being actually in low-income countries, and we really have been supporting not only refugee, but also hosting communities. And that's how it's so important to tackle from a humanitarian perspective, but also development perspective. We are doing that for low-income, but also middle-income, if you look at what's happening today in Jordan and or Lebanon as well, impacted by the Syrian crisis. So this is a good example when we talk about the whole buzzword, partnership, what does it mean? Well, it means that at the end of the day, when you have a Syrian child who is in Jordan, she or he does not understand what is humanitarian and development. And she or he is right. And that's why up to us to change the way of operating and making sure that we both provide support on the humanitarian fund. And I think UNICEF is doing a fantastic work, as well as looking at the systems, the long-term systems we try to do.
Minister.
Moi, je voudrais ajouter.
I wanted to add something to what has been said. It's true that we have to be concerned about the education of young refugees. But don't forget that the young refugees are coming into a fragile zone where you have children who have the same kinds of needs. They're not refugees, but they're coming out of the local communities, and they also have problems when it comes to having access to education. That's why you need a global response for the refugees and for the children who are there, who sometimes are children from displaced people from the past. So sometimes the refugees can create an imbalance between the local communities that host the refugees and the refugees. In Niger, we wanted to respond through another program which we established with the World Bank, and it's been launched, this program. And this program looks after not only the needs of the refugees when it comes to education and other things, but also takes into consideration the needs of the host communities who are living with these refugees when it comes to education, because they too have gaps in education and delays.
What Frank describes is really important, because one of the major impediments to doing what everybody agrees is urgent is education in emergencies often falls in the cracks between emergency and development funds. So a part of what this whole fragility approach enables us to do is get out of those stovepipes and say, what's the problem here? What's the joint diagnosis that we are able to collectively undertake that enables us to put funding where the problems are. And this is well into the Syria crisis. There were huge funding gaps for education for the Syrian refugee children. And it's not because nobody saw the need, it's that we got strangled up in funding stovepipes. That's the challenge that we, I think, are on the verge of really making a substantial breakthrough with.
And that brings to a point, then I'll go to the audience, which is that people don't live in silos. You know, people have to work in silos, but that is where no one's lives take place. None of you have a part of your day where you eat breakfast and then a part of your day where you're working or a part of your day when you're answering emails. Most of the time, all three things are going on at the same time. And so for people who are in fragile situations, they don't know these differences, nor should they ever have to. And I remember interviewing one mother who said to me that her son cried every single day when he had to go to work instead of to school, because he had been in school until age 15. And I said to her, well, what do you do when he cries? And she looked at me as if I'd asked her the dumbest question and said, well, what do you think I do? I cry with him. You know, and that's what we see all of these parents facing, who just want their children to have more opportunity than they do in that very fragile moment. And so I think that's what's so important about the holistic approach that you're each bringing to this discussion. And I want to go to the audience for what I think would be our final question as we head toward wrapping up. But I want to thank you, and please.
Okay. My name is Marcus Freitas. I'm from Brazil. And I was really attracted by the name of the panel, Towards Sustainable Peace. I've been coming to these meetings of the World Bank for quite a long time, and I did remember that fragility has been discussed over the last 10 years at least, as far as I remember. Where have we failed? Now, if we're going to do like a mea culpa, to understand what are the reasons that today we have more refugees in the world than ever before, it seems that we are doing something that is not working. So if you're going to tell me, okay, as we plan ahead, what were the mistakes that we made that we should not do anymore, so that we actually find out the solution that will end up with these refugee camps 10, 20, 30 years from now? Thank you.
Thank you. And I would imagine most everyone has an answer to this question about how do we make sure we're not in the same place, or worse, a decade from now.
Well, you could have a day-long conversation about that, but let me make a couple of observations. First is that I don't think that the development efforts have focused enough on the political problems that are a part of creating fragility. And there has been too stark of a separation between development, between the political dynamics in a country, and between the security problems in a country. And USIP worked with Stanford University and Chatham House to do a 10-year retrospective of Afghanistan collective efforts, and found that there were actually 3 completely separate efforts underway. The militaries, the coalition militaries, were fighting the Taliban. The intelligence agencies were hunting al-Qaeda, and the development actors were trying to build a state. And in fact, those efforts undercut each other. They had a different understanding of the problem set, a different time horizon, and as a result, we weren't able to make the progress that the level of effort would have indicated. So it's about getting a greater alignment, again, about an understanding of what the problem is, and understanding that to sustain the good development gains in things like education, health, agriculture, you need to look at why is the governance not being responsive and accountable to its people, and how do you understand the focus on the social compact that is frayed or broken. That's the missing heartbeat. That's very, very difficult, but without which I don't believe that we will truly get to a sustainable peace. And I do believe that the fragility, conflict, and violence agenda has moved us right up to that problem set and given us a better way forward. I'm quite optimistic about where we are right now with the convergence of the understanding of the problem set. and we are poised to make a bigger difference.
So I think there has been, if you look at the independent evaluation group, an assessment actually about the work of the bank on the fragility, conflict, and violence agenda. So I don't know if you have seen it. I would encourage you. It's public. It's an excellent report. And it really takes stock about what has been done and also what are the gaps where we need to move forward. I think there are a few points that Nancy rightly put on the table. And what's interesting that you have partners from different mandate, different organizations saying the same thing, which would be quite interesting to process. The first one is about recognizing the importance of partnership. The whole point about saying when you're working in Central African Republic, and when you have the state that has control about 15, 20, 25% of the territory, do you think that development by itself can make it? Of course not. It's development, but with strong alignment with broader agenda, how to work with security, peace-building actors. And it's exactly the way that we are moving forward by really trying to operationalize partnership. Partnership is not only nice when you talk about it in Washington, D.C., but it's actually even better when you operationalize it on the field. How to work on the issue of refugee, working closely with other organizations, with UNHCR. So this whole point about scaling up, operationalizing partnership, so that you can increase your effectiveness on the ground is something that we have been actually taking some lessons learned from the past and building more and more. So I think that's one. The second point, and Nancy said it, it's about before moving with financing, let's make sure first that we are understanding better the key drivers of fragility. All our country partnership framework today in those countries that are impacted by fragility, conflict, and violence are being informed by what we call some assessment of key drivers of fragility. And there are some that we can take care from the development perspective, but there are others that require this partnership with organizations with different mandate. You remember what Nancy mentioned, what is being done in Burkina Faso? We are not doing this diagnostic by ourselves because we need the partnership with the EU, with the UN, with the Africa Development Bank that bring a lot of expertise but also mandates that are different from ours. And that, I think, has been a major improvement if you look what happened over the past 5 and 10 years. There are many other lessons. I encourage you to look at this IEG report, which is actually very good. It's public, very transparent, which has been informing completely the strategy on which we are working. Humility is important. Taking lessons learned and saying how we do and how we can do better. This is what we are working on. Last but not least, it's also the financing. I don't like to put that first, but it's super important. The fact that Axel mentioned that we are doubling our financing in those countries, this is something. We move from $7 to $14 billion, and hopefully we'll do even more moving forward. So I think it's also important to be focused and selective to see where we can have the biggest impact. If you are serious about tackling poverty, which we are, it's precisely in this set of environment. So there's been a lot of change, and at different level, if I may say. I could also say the fact that we are putting more feet on the ground, much more staff on the ground. Today we have 800 staff that are working in those fragile settings. We have increased our footprint significantly. This is something that was not necessarily the case 5, 10, 15 years ago. There's been a lot of change, but again, a lot remains to be done. Thank you.
Minister, and then I'll go to
Merci.
Thank you. I didn't get the name of the Brazilian gentleman, but what I must tell you is that 10 years ago, we in the Sahel, we had peace. We didn't have terrorists. We didn't have Boko Haram. We didn't have all these massive numbers of terrorists who left Libya to come to our country and to destroy our peace. That's the first thing. And the second thing, and the gentleman mentioned it, is the issue of funding. Financing is important. Niger was under IDA 17, it had a normal envelope for an IDA country. But with IDA 18, we were able to get a special treatment for countries that were FCV countries. And our envelope doubled under IDA. That had an impact. We were able to carry out major activities that had an impact on this issue. So financing is important, but you must know that 10 years ago, we were peaceful in our tents, and our peace was destroyed by Boko Haram and by the war in Libya, which up to now is still a threat for us. Thank you.
Henrietta, I know you wanted to.
So let me add in some thoughts also. I think we haven't valued peace enough. You know, it sounds somewhat simple, but what happens if you don't value the peace, then you don't try for that. You think of all the other ways to change the countries and to address fragility. But when we look around the world, the fact that the crises are more numerous, they are longer, they are much more vicious, it is because we don't value that peace. So if you look at it from a child's eyes, because of UNICEF we see lots of children, 10 years is not a long time if you're a peace negotiator, but to a child it's an extremely long period of time. I mean, the difference between being 0 and 10 or 10 and 20 is just a very long time. So we don't take time into account. So if we were to see it through a child's eyes, that would help. The second thought is that predictive analytics, the World Bank has really begun to move in this. If we can see where the drought is coming, where the terrorists are coming, where the countries are imploding, the governments, it helps us. We use it in Ebola and Zika and a variety of other things, but predictive analytics, I think, are going to be a big help. So those of us who are doing multi-indicator surveys, this is going to be very useful. And thirdly, I think we've undervalued who can help. Often we think of young people, children, women, as being beneficiaries who have to be looked after in times of fragility and conflict and violence. But sometimes they are the actors who can change it. I think now that we see the demographics of young people, the World Bank is really starting to move on this. I think they can become real actors to change this, and that we could actually overcome many of this if we really put the power of young people and women to work.
And I think as we just go through the row for a last word, I want to pick up on that piece because, you know, we can't count what we don't see. And so many times we don't see women as agents of their own lives, women who are agents of change. And I think it is challenging because people don't invest in victims, they invest in survivors. And that narrative, which has always been, I've seen externally rather than internally imposed, is one that I think is changing, and I think is up to everybody here to actually catch up with what's happening on the ground. And so with that, each of you, I wanted to ask you a brief question to finish, which is, what gives you hope? Because we've talked about so many challenges, and I want to finish on what you see on the ground so many times, which is hope amid adversity. And I wanted to just ask each of you what in your work gives you hope. And I'll go fast down and maybe start with you, Nancy, and then go to the minister and go down the row.
Well, I'll just pick up where Henrietta left off. Every year we bring 30 young leaders from conflict countries who are themselves refugees who have suffered from Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab to Dharamsala for a dialogue with the Dalai Lama, who is himself a refugee. And I leave for that this Saturday. And it is an extraordinary dialogue that talks about the inner resilience that you need to maintain to be a peace builder and to continue on a pathway when a lot of anger and conflict is all around you, and the courage of these young leaders to withstand that and to be real role models is deeply inspiring. And for a global icon of peace that the Dalai Lama is, I know he draws as much inspiration from these youth leaders as they do, and it certainly gives me great hope.
Thank you. Minister.
Merci.
Thank you. What gives me hope is that we no longer look at the issue of fragility as a matter of human assistance and being only resolvable by human assistance, humanitarian assistance. I think there has been an awareness at the global level. The issue of fragility must be an issue of development. At the very heart of development is the human being. The human being is vulnerable, is fragile. So we cannot make a difference between those that are going to be assisted by UNICEF or others. The human being at the heart of all this is the actor for development and of development. The moment that this question is deeply anchored, rooted in the institutions, in civil society, I believe this will be the greatest motivation for hope. And I'm thrilled to see that at the World Bank, this issue is part of a strategy and is the object of a strategy. And as a participant on behalf of borrowing countries from French-speaking Africa for the process of IDA 19's reconstitution and replenishment, I am thrilled to see that representatives of borrowing countries and donor countries, they are all aware that the solution is development. Thank you.
Please.
So peace, stability, and resilience will be the watchwords. And I think that once you get the World Bank moving on this area in a much more determined, strategic way, with more resources, it can really change the world out there. And so for all of us who are operators on the field, we should take note, we should advocate, and we should really get behind this in a public and private way.
Frank, with that, I'll give you the last word.
I think what is inspiring is to hear colleagues here on the panel, leadership and commitment of government to a level that everybody understand that business as usual is not working anymore. If you see the whole focus of Minister Kane on prevention, on realizing that before it becomes a security issue, this is clearly a development agenda in terms of making sure that the government is committed to address grievances in a way that it will not lead to escalation of violence. This is something that I think is inspiring and that calls for all of us, regardless of where you come from, private sector, CSO. I had a great discussion this morning with Save the Children, all the great work which we done, UNICEF, UCIP, to support. So I think the commitment, the leadership, and the understanding that prevention agenda is so important is something which is, I think, relatively new, and you see it more and more compared to 10, 15 years ago.
This panel has given us so much to think about, right? The idea of no more business as usual, the idea of making sure that you don't just think about the refugees, but the places where these children and adults are coming from, right? And what they're facing on the ground. When we're talking about governance, when we're talking about adding financial capacity and adding really financial innovation, which is not always in the right, adding financial innovation to places that are really pushing through very difficult times. I wish all of us to go out there with some hope, with some resolution, with some commitment, and with the endurance to do hard work. Because all of this is really not about any of one of us who have the privilege of being in this atrium, but it's about the entrepreneur in a tough environment sitting on a floor somewhere trying to figure out how to create 1 or 2 or 10 or 20 jobs, or the teacher trying to figure out how to educate young people when everything else has gone away. And I think if we go through with their examples and go forward, doing all of the work with all of the institutions and the governments here, then in 10 years, God willing, we will be in a very different place. Thank you so much, and a good night.